For the third lecture in Module 1, we're going to be talking about identity as it pertains to gender. I want to remind you of the objectives for this module: to define terms that describe biological sex and gender, to name and explain 4 theoretical classifications for the study of gender, and to recognize language associated with diverse gender identities. So let's start out with the question, what is identity? We often refer to our own identity as an internal sense of self. Stable identity implies a strong fixed sense of an individual identity, whereas fluid identity suggests a desire or an expectation to change identities with a particular context. We take a lot of how we understand gender and gender identities from George Herbert Mead, who was a social psychologist who talked about the impact of significant others and generalized other on human development of identity. So a significant other is a person with whom you have a close relationship, who you trust, who tells you basically who you are, reflects who you are back to yourself. And this generalized other becomes interesting in the study of gender because a generalized other is a community that you have membership in that creates a way of being that you are expected to enact. And so that generalized other becomes a part of how you see yourself. When we begin to talk about identity, we talk about something called gender presentation or gender performance. And gender presentation refers to the nonverbal and verbal gendering of the body. So Judith Butler, who is a philosopher and a gender theorist, has explained gender performativity to us in a way that I think is challenging, complicated, but we can kind of get at the basic idea of what she's talking about. What Butler suggests is that bodies enact repetitive acts of socially sanctioned femininity and masculinity, and that these repetitive acts become a naturalizing of gender identity so that it's more about the repetition of what is expected of femininity than it is about actually being or feeling or thinking one is a feminine body. We can also understand identities as they are influenced by family, and family has a large impact on how one understands themselves as a gendered body. And as we know, family is influenced by social location, culture, time, and femininity is often linked to human qualities of nurturing, sensitivity, deference, and all of those qualities become learned behaviors through family and society. Some people explore what we would call alternative femininities, and these are femininities that don't kind of line up with those expectations. We'll read more about that as you move your way through the reading material in the course. When we look at masculinity as a gender identity, it's often linked to the qualities of assertiveness, independence, and strength. You may have heard of the term toxic masculinity. Toxic masculinity is a term that's emerged in an analysis of traditional masculinity as harmful to men, harmful to women, the ways that the expectation of masculinity have affected people and the way that they interact with others in society. When we look at trans identities, we can understand that transgender labels matter. The way that people use words to explore and explain their identities are very important. So somebody who may identify as non-binary is referring to the fact that they potentially have multiple gender identities, or they see gender as something that they put on rather than something that is within them. A trans woman refers to someone who was assigned a male identity at birth but lives their life as a girl or as a woman. A trans man refers to someone who was assigned female biological identity at birth and lives their life as a man. And remember that this does not necessarily mean that they're transsexual, that they've had a physical transition, but rather that they are trans bodies living their lives transgendered. To understand queer identities, we can look at queer as an identifying term that represents a challenge or a push against the power of heteronormativity. And so queer is not always connected to LGBTQ bodies. Rather, it is a way of understanding identities as a resistance. So queer can be a political identification. It doesn't have to be a political identification. And it's linked back to our conversation about queer theory that we talked about in Lecture 2. So this lecture has introduced you to the idea that identity is an important concept in the discussion of gender and communication. And as you think about Lecture 3, I'd like you to consider the following questions. Question 1, are there benefits to understanding gender identity as fluid rather than stable? Question 2, what is your personal definition of femininity? And why do you have this definition? Question 3, how has toxic masculinity affected your life? Question 4, how can you adjust your language choices to be inclusive of trans-identified individuals? And question 5, how has your understanding of the word queer changed after this lecture?